First story, late night shopping experience. We are a family of 3, therefore our grocery expenses are substantial. My spouse works for a tech firm, and I am currently raising our 3 children, ages 7, 10, and 3, at home. At least twice a week I go grocery shopping. I typically visit the King Colon near our house, but I also occasionally visit the Target that is close by. In our sleepy hamlet, there are very few grocery stores, those 2 being the only ones. In order to provide as much background as possible, my family is Italian, and I am 40 years old. I was 39 years old when this happened, not even a year ago. One day I went shopping considerably later than normal as I was running behind schedule. I ran over to the store with my flyers and coupons because the King Colon closes at 10, and it was clearly beyond 9. I had to make a fast trip to the grocery store because the kids were whining about not having enough food in the house. Most days my husband was home from work by this point, so I had to go shopping with my 3-year-old daughter, Haley. I consider it a pleasure that I was able to go shopping by myself for once. When I arrived at the King Colon, it was mostly empty because it was about to close. I snatched up a cart and got to work making my rounds through the aisles, picking up everything on my list plus everything that was discounted. I was astonished to feel a tap on my shoulder while I was in the cereal aisle. When I turned, I saw an extremely tan man who was around my height, wearing jeans, a black OT, a red zipper-up hoodie, and a baseball cap. He said he was sorry to have surprised me and that he had been searching around for a certain bag of chips that I had in my cart. I walked him straight to the aisle where I discovered the chips after I kindly informed him of its location. He said he had looked but couldn't find it. With a terrible gasp, he thanked me. I smiled and turned to get back to my cart, but he interrupted with a meaningless digression about how much he enjoyed those chips and something ridiculous about the ingredients or the absence of one. I kept trying to give him the impression that I was slowly making my way back to my cart, but he was not picking up on it. When he paused strangely and said, "Gosh, you're pretty," that's when I said thank you and realized I had to go back to shopping before they closed. He followed me to my cart, but he didn't stop chatting to me. I informed him that I really would just like to shop in peace at this time as respectfully as possible. At last he appeared to grasp the message and turned to leave. However, I noticed that man circling the aisles for the remainder of the night I was at the store, and every time he passed the aisle I was in, he would slow down or even stop and just stare down at me. I raced through my shopping since I was becoming more and more uncomfortable. When I eventually finished, I proceeded to the checkout. Red hoodie guy appeared with 2 or 3 products waiting online directly behind me while I was emptying my cart. Though he no longer speaks, I could still feel his stare in the back of my mind. As I wheeled my cart away after finishing my checkout, the man said, "Have a good night, ma'am." But I chose to ignore him. The red hoodie guy stood in the parking lot staring at me as he made his way to his car while I was unloading my car. He climbed into what must have been a 30-year-old junk-looking Honda. He just sat in the car, though, without turning it on. When I was finally done loading my car, I got in, turned on the engine, and left the parking lot. I felt safe enough to drive home after a few quick glances in my rearview mirror and the absence of any headlights behind me. I didn't know there was a car with its headlights off slowly approaching our house until I parked into the driveway and turned to look down the street to my left. A couple of homes down, he pulled to the curb. That Honda from the parking lot, it seemed. I entered the house and yelled for my spouse. He looked worried when he got downstairs, so I told him that a creep was following me home. The automobile had already left by the time he rushed outside to the porch. We heard some scuffling outside in the side yard late one night the next weekend while we were all in bed. My spouse went to inspect what it was after I gave him a shake and he opened the window. He heard the window slide open and observed someone trying to unlock the side gates to the backyard just below the window. The man looked up and began to run. My spouse snatched the baseball bat from beneath the bed and hurried out. He also claimed that he attempted to pursue the automobile after noticing it speeding down the street and returning a minute later. Exactly captured the look of the dingy Honda that the red hoodie guy was operating. Clearly, that was him. Despite the late hour, a police officer showed up at our house in less than 5 minutes after we called the police. I gave the best description I could of the man and his vehicle, and that was that. He never came back to our house, even after witnessing my irate spouse using a bat to chase his car on foot. It still makes me uneasy knowing someone with that level of creepiness knows where I live. Story 2. Walbon's Overnight Shift. I used to work at Walbon's while I was in college. A few poor people would constantly be forced to work that terrible shift because the one I worked at was a 24-hour operation. I had assumed that as a 20-something college student, my employer would never assign me to an overnight shift. Sadly, I believe that she noticed my academic calendar and my Monday and Wednesday free, which made her think that I would be a wonderful fit for an occasional overnight shift. I once noticed that my shift was set for Tuesday night from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. I had to confirm that was correct by checking the schedule 3 times. When I questioned my supervisor about why I was assigned to the evening shift, he informed me that since I was over 18, I really didn't have much of an option. I felt horrible seeing it. I thought about quitting, but I had to keep the job and the money. So I just decided to give it a shot this once, and then tell my supervisor that I have to study for my classes and can't do it again. I relieved my coworker Amanda when I got to the store at noon. To save electricity at this hour, half of the store's lights were off. When I arrived, the store was surprisingly full. I think more people than I anticipated would make hurried midnight shopping runs. But after 1 in the morning, it was deserted. There were probably only 3 patrons there the whole time. The later it grew in the evening, the fewer patrons there were. By now it was almost 2 in the morning. As bored as a human could be. Lie feasible, and it had been more than an hour since a customer had left. There had to be more workers in the building, so I wondered if they were present. I reasoned that they couldn't have a 20-year-old operating the entire organization by himself. Every few minutes, a bald man who appeared to be a manager would frequently walk by the front registers. He was carrying a tiny backpack-style bag in his hand and had a key ring with about 10 keys tied to his khakis. When he inquired if it was my first day on the job, I replied that it was my first night shift. "Excuse me, are you the manager?" he added. He shook my hand without introducing himself and asked if I could sort the pallets in the store's back warehouse while he watched the front. Although I wasn't precisely sure what that meant, I would understand. As I moved to the back of the shop, I noticed him working on the front door. It appeared as though he was trying to lock it by reaching for a switch on the side of the door. When I entered the rear warehouse, I noticed a tall man who appeared to be in his 30s, wearing a manager's vest that said Walbon's. Identifying himself as Rob, the night manager, he pointed to my apron. Since he was the sole manager on duty, he asked me to identify the man I was referring to when I described the man from earlier. I answered, "Oh, I thought the guy in the front was the night manager." To which he looked confused and said, "Who?" Before we knew it, every light in the store had gone out in the warehouse. Rob asked me to wait in the warehouse while he investigated the situation. I watched as he entered the store through the warehouse doors and into the complete darkness, with the sole source of light coming from the dairy cooler's still-on lights. I heard a door opening from inside the warehouse while I was sitting on a box on the pallet, trying to email any pals who might be awake about what was going on. It was across from the dairy fridge and freezer on the opposite side of the warehouse. There were 2 routes from the warehouse back into the retail space. I stayed there, ears pricked to listen for any noises, and then I heard slow, quiet footsteps approaching and a voice that said, "Hey kid, you in here?" It wasn't Rob's voice though. It was that bald guy's. Quietly, I hurried through the warehouse doors and entered the store. In an attempt to locate Rob, I jogged to the front of the store, but I was unsuccessful. When I yelled his name, nothing happened. The exit door was locked when I attempted to manually open it after grabbing my jacket and failing to open on its own. I nearly shouted when I turned around and heard footsteps coming from behind me, until I realized it was Rob, the manager. After unlocking the door with a quick flip of a lever or something, he whispered in terror, "Hurry up and get out." He trailed me in the rear. After we left the business, he immediately called the police, and I overheard their entire exchange. His belief was that an armed individual had locked himself into the Wallbonds and was most likely attempting to rob the establishment. He informed the operator that I had urged him to report to the police that I believed he was going to hurt me at the warehouse. I'm sure he advised me to either wait in my car or leave, so the store wouldn't be responsible for anything if something went wrong. After a short while, I went to sit in my car and observed, and 10 minutes later, at least 4 police cars were outside the store. They all stayed inside for a bit, and I walked out because I couldn't see what was happening, but I didn't give up after that. My supervisor filled me in on everything that had happened when I returned to work the following day. The bald man was seen on security camera circling the area, appearing shady, and making sure it was safe for him to do whatever it was he was going to do after locking the doors. He turned out the store's lights. The cameras captured him walking directly to the warehouse that he had instructed me to visit. I find that to be the most frightening aspect because, had he been armed and plundering the place, he might have been headed to put a gun to my head or something like. Before the cops arrived, the camera captured him departing via the warehouse way emergency escape. After speaking with my manager, I ultimately decided not to work a midnight shift again, and I continued working at that job for a few more months. That man may or may not have been identified. Story 3. Great American Night Restock Employee. In a rather rural area, I used to work as a night restocker at a supermarket. It was the biggest and best supermarket in the area, and it was named Great American. I would start working as soon as the store closed at 10 o'clock. Before the next working day, I would reload the shelves and organize everything from 10 p.m. until 3 a.m. at the latest. Naturally, I was in possession of the store's keys for the evening hours. Alfonso or Terry Carter and me would make up the 2-person squad. Terry and I were meant to be working together tonight. When I got to the store, I was able to enter the back where all of the unsold merchandise was kept. I began by bringing a full pallet of boxes outside to the retail area using the pallet jack. I began by moving the older loaves to the front and the younger loaves to the back in the bread and nuts section. I realized halfway through that I still hadn't seen Terry. I made my way to the rear section of the store, where our belongings are kept, and the inventory was located. He had not returned there yet. After going back to work for 30 minutes without seeing Terry, I walked back to the back of the store since I had left the back door cracked open with a door stopper for him to come by. I saw that the rear door was closed, but he wasn't inside. That implied to me that Terry was somewhere about here. I considered it strange that he kicked the door stopper outside rather than bringing it inside when I tried to open the rear door. Terry's name rang out throughout the room when I yelled it. I decided to call him when he didn't return my call. I asked him whether he was at work when he picked up the phone, sounding like he was in bed. He claimed he was sick and wouldn't be coming in tonight. I felt a cold run through me. When I told him that someone had kicked the door stopper off, he suggested that it might have just come loose on its own. That night was the only one with a scheduled shift. Feel better, I assured him, and we hung up. I kicked the door stopper under the door fairly firmly, so I wasn't sure whether I was satisfied that it came undone on its own. I glanced around to make sure nobody was there. Was in the rear of the shop, and I returned to work when I didn't see anyone, although having a nagging feeling of dread the entire time. While stacking the remaining bread, I heard a tremendous sound reverberate from the other side of the store. All right, somebody had to enter here now. I rose from my kneeling position and proceeded to the central aisle, which connected to every other aisle. I turned to face the aisle and stood there for a few moments when a man in black strolled past the center aisle and glanced down at me from the dairy section on the other side of the store. My heart began to sink. It reminded me of the scene in the movie Signs, where the extraterrestrial passes by the birthday celebration. I had to use common sense and consider the possibility that our supervisor had not informed me that someone else was covering for Terry's shift. I exclaimed, "Excuse me," loudly, as I proceeded to rapidly walk down the center aisle. Since he had gone through an aisle toward the front of the store, I had turned to look to the left of every aisle I passed. At its completion, he was standing there, fully facing my direction, waiting. He turned and walked away in the direction I had just come from when he saw me. I let out another, "Excuse me," and I started sprinting down that aisle to get to him. I haven't had a chance to see his face clearly yet. I followed him down the aisle till I reached the front where the cash registers were, and I saw him all the way to the end of the bread aisle. Behind the shelf was half of his body obscured. He began to wave me over with his jaw hanging open, but he said nothing. I was freaking out over his face. I asked, "Who are you?" and made another attempt to talk to him before he vanished behind the shelf. For this, I wasn't getting paid enough. I went outside and got into my car to give my boss a call. When he finally picked up, I informed him that a random freak was prowling the store. He instructed me to either phone the police or try to get him out of there. I dialed 911 because I was not going to try to take a mad individual out of the store by force. I waited in my vehicle for a police vehicle to arrive. I said hello to the policeman and asked him to come inside with me. After searching the area for the man, we came across him once more in one of the aisles, this time standing eerily as though he were playing a game. He truly did listen to the policeman when he told him to come here. The craziest man I had ever seen was placed in handcuffs. He licked his lips and continued to look at me and smile. Huge bags were under his eyes. He said he was looking for a snack in response to the policeman, but it was the only thing he said. As the policeman walked him back outside to his car, I didn't like the way he was staring at me. It was this smile that still makes me feel uneasy and scary. From then on, I worked as usual. It goes without saying that I never again left any of the doors open.